And what I would like to do today is to bring it into my world through what I deal with every day. So what with the most recurrent, my, sorry, yes, it was off. Now it's, I'll start over then. So in this presentation today, I'd like you to bring here into my world by just showing you what I do every day as a textile archaeologist, and by starting my analysis with the most recurrent tools and textile evidence that archaeologically we have, and obviously because I am an expert on the material culture of this island, I will be obviously using the material culture of Cyprus. But before moving into Cyprus and its very interesting textile record, I'd like to reflect on what textiles are. Because textiles are not just one type of objects, they are a vast array of artifacts. And sometimes they are not even artifacts, they are just components of them. And they are fundamental. They live, let's say, in our own environments, even when we are not there. They are clothes, so they are always with us every day, but they can also be blankets, carpets, pillows, covers, carriers, and even more in the past, if we think about, they could have been sails, they could have been part of saddles and means of transportation, everything really. They are truly ubiquitous in our daily lives, and that is something that we tend to forget, because the more something is with us, the more we take it for granted. Textiles, or better fabric, are binary system of spun thread, as simple as it is. But textiles, and especially textile production, is something very complex somehow. And for us as archaeologists, as textile archaeologists, we have this very clear, that I always use in my presentation, diagram by Anderson Stred, who had been the previous director of the Center for Textile Research in Copenhagen, that describe textile production based on three fundamental pillars: resources, technology, and society. It is obvious that we need raw materials to be transformed in any production, to be transformed into what we want to get at the end. We need technology, so the ways we found to transform these materials. But first and foremost, we also need society. We need producers, consumers, we need people who had the chance to exchange these objects. But we also need ideology, we need ritual, we need all those aspects that they may have impacted and influenced on a production and on what it was expected to get out of these raw materials. But us, as archaeologists, we don't start from the three pillars to get to know what textile production is. It's quite the opposite. We use textile production to have insights on resources, technology, and society. Most of the times, these three things are absolutely interwoven. So even if we have a better look on technology through textile production, we eventually land into social and aspects and resources. But in some cases, obviously, this is less evident, and we have to progress with our research. But what do we find? What do I have, and I can start from to investigate our textiles in archaeology? Well, if we find ourselves on Cyprus or in any other place in the Mediterranean, or in an area with a temperate climate, where we have an alternance of a dry season with a wet season, cold, hot temperatures, and let's say conditions that they are not extreme, that they change, they are unstable, that they are not like extreme like in deserts or like in the Arctic, or that they are not a specific condition, everything is burnt and sealed, for example. So in that case, we don't have anything organic preserved, or very, very little. So textile production is investigating a production without products most of the times, which is very elusive, very difficult. What do we have then? We have the tools. And either we are like in an excavation, or lovely in a museum, studying perhaps an old collection or legacy data. That's what we get on Cyprus, especially the most. Loom weights and spindles. But first of all, before getting to know better these tools, let's have a brief overlook of the periods that I'd like to touch, and obviously like of Cyprus. That's just to remind us that textile evidence, it's really ubiquitous as well as textiles were, and most of the sites, if not perhaps nearly all of them, in all of these periods, especially from the Bronze Age onwards, actually yielded textile evidence to us. As I was saying, spindles and loom weights will be the protagonists of our story today. But what are and how are normally these tools associated by archaeologists to immediately to an action? So spindles are immediately linked to spinning, okay, which, to be fair, I would prefer to say thread making, and I will tell you in a while why. And loom weights are associated to weaving, or even better, or more specifically, to the warp-weighted loom, which is a specific type of loom. But as we can see, loom weights and spindles, those are not the tools, those are just part of them. And this is something that us, as textile archaeologists, we never stress enough, that we also don't have the final product, yes, but we don't even have like the complete tool that we need to produce the final product. So it's even more elusive, it seems. So I had the privilege of sitting to very interesting seminars while I was in Cambridge. Some of them were delivered by experts in Paleolithic and Mesolithic material culture. And there is this very interesting concept that they have been using a lot, that of composite materials or tools. And in archaeology, well, the definition is rather simple for us. It's implement constructed by combining multiple materials and that they have multiple components. For example, a stone blade could have been originally a stone blade just used as a blade, or acted into a wooden handle with binding. In that case, from a single one piece, one material object would have become a composite tool. So what it seems to us something very simple. It's actually a mini revolution in human evolution, because composite material didn't just represent something that really helped us. Everything became more efficient, more hand-friendly, ergonomic, easy to use, even safer. But they also were something important for the development of technologies, because having something with a lot of components affords many more opportunities of assembling it, even by mistake. And if you can assemble something in a different way or using slightly different material because it's you don't have that, it's handy at that moment, or you have to adjust the stuff, then you can create something different. And this something different can have an impact on what you are making. And this is called eventually a technological change. So this kind of affordance, I think, it's very much incorporated in what textile tools are in their essence, even though textile tools really look like all the same sometimes. These are all the different types of spindles that we find from the early Bronze Age, from the beginning of the Bronze Age into Hellenistic Roman periods. And as you can see, all a little bit look like the same. They are like large beads, and they are vertically perforated. Normally, they are made of terracotta, but we also have stone examples or bone examples. And we have many different types, shapes. These depend on, obviously, like on the periods, on preferences, but also they have a little impact on the function. They may be decorated, they may be more rough, and that's also dependent on the style and the preferences of the makers of the tools, obviously. As I said, for a long time, these or variants of, let's say, this setting of the tool were taught being like the only way or the main way a spindle and a spindle in general were used. So that in textile archaeology, we based our understanding of spindles, like the way we study them and analyze them, we base these kinds of analysis on experiments and on our understanding of the use of the tool, like that. And that is called drop spinning. But I will illustrate in a bit how it works. Basically, what I practically look at when I have a spindle on my table, okay? I take all measurements, including weight, and I may also have a look at parts that they are not immediately connected to the function of the tool. For example, the diameter and perforation. And this is, for example, also to have some sort of idea of how big, for example, the rod or shaft of the spindle could have been, because obviously it couldn't have been larger than the perforation. Ideally, it would have been slightly thinner than the perforation, sometimes considerably thinner. It could have been fixed, but the optimal, obviously, setting is to have it slightly thinner. So I always try to have what we do in textile, in archaeology in general, but in textile archaeology especially, is really to look at every details and to consider indirect evidence for what we don't have. And I also try to have a look, obviously, at traces, in particular if they are if traces of use are present. But how then we can use the parameters to try to squeeze a bit more of information of how a spindle and, in general, a spindle worked. So, in this setting that I was showing you before, as we can see, we have a bundle of fibers, and this tool rotates freely in the air. And the rotation enables at the same time to pull out the fibers and twist it in what it is a continuous unit, the thread, all the fibers. Okay, so the spindle here works like a flywheel, which is somehow a weight, okay, that stabilizes the rotation in a single point. But if in the beginning weight was considered the most fundamental parameter to try and understand how a spindle and a spindle works, it has now become more clear that what we have to look is also to the rotation of the object. So weight is a static parameter. What we need is weight in motion. So what we do now is we consider the maximum diameter, so the measurements along which the mass, let's say, distributes while rotating, and of course the mass itself, so the weight. There is a simple way to plot these two measurements without having to do any calculation, which is effective and gives you an impression on where, for example, fast and light walls can stay, and so on, where we have tools with mixed characteristics, and where we have higher and higher diameters that they are larger and heavier walls. And in this case, why is this is important to me? Because to higher rotation and lighter boards, they are normally associated finer fibers, shorter fibers, and finer thread. While the more we have a broader spindle and heavier one, then in that case, it is more suitable to spin or to make thread that is thicker and with longer fibers. So if I have an assemblage of spindles, I can then establish if there were spindles that were more suitable to be used for producing lighter, thinner thread with finer fabric, or on the opposite, like thicker thread and with longer fibers. But we can also combine the two parameters to calculate and have obtain one single parameter that is perhaps considered by some scholar better to have or more clear. And we can calculate what is called the moment of inertia, which is basically the combination. It's used in geometrical formulae that are connected to geometric solids to calculate how much of energy they need to start their rotation and eventually when the kinetic energy, let's say, when eventually stops and how fast and slow it is. And the higher number you get, the slower is the object. And so with all the implication that I just told you, and the lower the number is, the faster is the object. And this is more theory, but if we stop and think for a moment of where we are, we realize that we are not at the beginning of the chaîne opératoire, was already introduced by Ellen and Chase today and yesterday. So the sequence of steps that allow us to go from the raw material to the final product. But we are a bit progressing to it. Chaîne opératoire has many research tools, framework, let's say, has some limitation and some advantages. But one of them is definitely to understand what we are missing. And what we are missing from the record is fiber preparation. Now, if you have spindles and if you make thread, you know that you have to prepare it. You have to extract it. You don't find fibers naturally going around in your environment. And sometimes extraction procedure and preparation can be mini chaîne opératoires themselves, and they require expertise and tools that unfortunately, like for this one to extract flax fibers, we don't find in the archaeological record, or we really, really rarely find it them because they are imperishable materials. Sometimes they can be used for other they are not so specific, like blades, for example, or they are not even tools. They are just activities that we do, like soaking the fibers, the plants in a pond, for example. These are all things that we missed from the archaeological record, that we know they are there because we have more progressed stages, let's say, in the production, but that we don't know exactly how they were conducted, for how long, where, by whom, by the same people who were spinning, other people, and how well, because if you the better you prepare your fibers, the better thread you will have. Same again for wool, for example. I put flax and wool because these are the two most common and mostly attested fibers, the two basic one in the Mediterranean for both prehistory until nearly the Roman time, where we also have a bit of cotton and silk coming in the story, which is also very interesting. And even if we have a lot of spindles, and that sometimes is everything we have for spinning, obviously, where we have the raised cases in which we have some sort of preserve final product, that's invaluable for us to understand. Like to understand what kind of thread they were making, and in general also of fibers, of course. And this is like, this very small. It's like a super small trace, but yet super important to me, because I could understand from these characteristics that I cannot tell from the walls themselves, like, for example, the twist direction of the thread, how really effectively big threads were, and so on. But when there was enough, like when the sample is large enough, then you may even try and, let's say, understand in which direction you were going with the interpretation of the material culture of tools. And this is what two extremely talented leading scholars in textile archaeology did a few years ago, Margarita Gleb and Susanna Harris. They possessed a huge database of textile remains from the Mediterranean and Europe, from prehistory, really from the Neolithic into the Roman period and beyond. And they observed and put all of them together. And what they found is that, especially for flax, or for the ones that were bast fibers, I've seen maybe perhaps you have noticed here that the thread is a bit loose. And one may think, okay, it's a bit loose because it's a super old piece. We are lucky enough to have it. It's obviously, but like they started observing that that was a consistent pattern. And when they looked these samples into a microscope, they found other point of evidence that they pointed to another technology or technique. There is a bit of a debate here among textile archaeology what it is splicing, but that they were not produced with a spindle used the way I showed you. So continuously pulling out and twisting at the same time the fibers into the thread, but that they were manually connected together and then twisted. And these two, let's say, moments were different. And to twist this kind of fibers after you prepare them, after you manipulate them to prepare the thread, let's say, there are many ways of doing it, and not all of them are they foresee the use of a spindle and a spindle wool in the way of drop spinning. You can do it, but you can also just twist them in a different way. So that's posed a problem, even if obviously spindle wools still are flywheels if are used for twisting in this case. If the thread is preformed, are we sure that we can use the same parameters, or that we have exactly the same outcomes that they have been used to study wars if we put these in the pictures, when we know that these was as widespread as the other technique for making thread, and it is a good alternative. More research is needed to clarify this aspect. Another thing that obviously I wanted to mention is that spindle wools and spindles in general are not just used to make thread out of fibers, but also you can twist more threads together to get a particular one if needed. So this association is not valid anymore. We have to think every time we approach a single small object of all the many possibilities, and encapsulated into these three possibilities, there are many more in the way you can use or handle a spindle or mount it, even without changing too much the body posture or the broader technology, let's say. There is a lot of variability out there that we cannot understand only by having these, unfortunately, but that we have to keep in mind every time. And this is also connected to society. As I said, like, for example, mounting and reassembling a spindle with a spindle can be done in many different ways. Some of them slightly change body gesture, posture, the way the spindle was operated. But in some cases where, for example, operated in the drop spinning, so hanging freely, if a spindle was attached at the lower, at the bottom, or at the top, that doesn't mean any kind of substantial changes in terms of technique used. But this setting was actually noticed has consistent preference for what's called the lower spindle. So the spindle was placed at the bottom of spindles in certain area of the Mediterranean, especially Italy, Greece, Anatolia, while other areas of the Mediterranean, in particular the Levant and Egypt, have preference for having the spindle was at the top. And this was considered like just a tradition, pretty much a cultural preference, but still important because transmitted to other generation of spinners, and because for us, as I said, everything is very much entangled. So we have a window on society, on social aspects here. However, for Cyprus, even though I think we have solid evidence to point to still think that, especially in the Bronze Age, we have a setting within the logos spinning area, let's say, especially because we have this kind of evidence here. So models and tentatively, even if it's a bit moved, probably this spindle with the spindle wheel, which is a metal one. If we look at traces, usual traces at the bottom of spindle wheels, even if these, and this now proved by experimental archaeology, were produced by the use, okay, so they indicate that spindle wheels were used, they cannot be so much just refer to logo spinning, because systematic studies for the Levantine, especially assemblages, have found that in the Levant, did a different setting produce very similar patterns. So this is not safe anymore to reiterate, let's say. But when I was doing my PhD, I always struggled in putting the people out there and imagining them. Also because a lot of our drawings, as you have seen, the faceless people, like nobody was there. And especially I was struggling because there is so much literature in textile studies connecting textile to women, suggesting that it's women work, which I obviously like, being woman. But I always wonder whether in Cyprus we had the evidence to support this. Because textile activities, if we look at them worldwide, they are not so much gendered. They are called fat swing activities. There is a lot of variability. So I was trying to look at strategies and parallels to make my way around of this problem. And I thought, what can be helpful for me in Cyprus? Maybe I can have a look at what was happening 100 years ago, because I knew that spindles were in use still. And I also knew that there were gendered activities in terms of production. And I even knew that there was a women market here in Nicosia 100 years ago, more or less, where women were coming from villages to exchange or sell this stuff. And one of the best products were textiles. So I was like, okay, maybe I can have a look and try to convince myself better, or find a way of where to look in the archaeological record. Let's have a better look. And when I never did archival research, which that is the way to proceed scientifically. For me, that wasn't a scientific project. It was just a strategy to understand my own record. When I was finding pictures and pictures of women spinning, I also found pictures of men, for me, spinning or making thread. And that's not the only one. There is other ones. There is another one that I particularly like, even with the priest spinning. And this, I was a bit shocked in the beginning. I didn't expect this, honestly. And I thought, well, okay, there must be something going on here. And that is also what actually prevented me, allowed me to be very careful in my PhD with the topic of gender. But if we leave aside for a moment the topic of gender, which I'd like to, I'll come back to it really quickly. But this picture is, if we look at them, they tell us a lot more. This sort of cross here, wooden cross here, it's basically a spindle wheel, okay? It works like a spindle wheel. And it's not inserted or created at neither at the bottom or at the top. It's pretty central. But that's definitely something different from these, okay? In terms of where the wall was placed. But somehow, these two actions, seen obviously steady in a photograph, they belong to broadly the same technology, which is more or less drop spinning. So interesting that on Cyprus in recent time we have a different positioning of the word of what was the flywheel, technologically speaking. I like that there is this sort of, was it this built over the years? Or had this been always there and we couldn't just see it in the Bronze Age? That's a very interesting question, I think. Another thing that that also put something in motion in my mind was to actually see spindle was 100 years ago. Now, we are used to think that a better technology replaces something older, which it's not effective anymore. If we do pottery, handmade pottery, and the beginning of the wheel use, for example, well, the wheel goes faster and allows us to produce better things, finer things in less time. So the same at some point in Europe and in the Levant, around 12th, 13th century, the spinning wheel appeared. And the spinning wheel is what put in motion a very long series of events that brought us to have the spinning jenny at some point and industrialized thread manufacture. But still, spindles with spindles remained there until very recent. As much as, for example, handmade pottery remained there in the late Bronze Age, as Chase observed yesterday, after the wheel was introduced. And this is another very interesting concept that I want to throw, maybe for discussion there. Do we really see a replacement in technologies, or perhaps like there is an addition and some sort of conservatism, or even older objects that they are perceived by us in our modern way as obsolete, they may have still a use, or they may be convenient in certain circumstances. And my story connected to this picture, especially, is that during my PhD, I had a lot of conversation with practitioners basically everywhere in this island. And some of them, from the elderly, obviously, remember their mothers and their grandmothers spinning, even if they were not able to do that. Weaving remained a little bit, but unfortunately, spinning is almost completely lost. So they remember them, and obviously, I always ask them, like, do you remember who was the person spinning in your house? My grandma, my mom, women. And I was never brave enough to show that picture to one of these ladies. Apart from the last one, I had a conversation with. And her response was illuminating, because in the beginning she told me, this is not Cyprus. And I was like, no, it is, I'm pretty sure. And then she was like, okay, but this is not textile production. This is something else. They were spinning or plying for me thread to use in leather making. In that very moment, I realized that we were both right. And there's something as unsettling as relativism was going on there. I was right. For me, that is the same thing. And it's even the same motor habit. And it's even something that one practitioner could have passed down to another one in a fuzzy way. Probably a mother could have told their son how to spin flax. The flax spun could have been used for leather, obviously. Well, for the lady, those were entirely different activities, both right. But let's move on and start dealing a little bit with the other protagonist of our talk today, the loom weights. So the loom weights as well have come even in a more variety, let's say, of shapes, especially from the late Bronze Age onwards, but they are connected. They all like follow the same principle. They are weights, so they must be hanged or attached somehow, like the spool where the thread is winded around. They must be attached to thread. And why? Because their function in the warp-weighted loom is to hold down the warp thread, which is the vertical thread in our loom. The warp-weighted loom is a relatively simple but clever device. It allows you to mechanically cross the thread, which is for us a definition of what it is a loom, in a way that you only simply have at least 2 rows of thread with alternating threads. So if one thread belongs to the back row, the other one must belong to the first one, the front one, and then again back and front, back and front. And they are separated, kept separated by this heddle here, this rod. And this allows to create a natural shed, so just an opening between the 2 lines if it's left down. And once we have this natural opening, we can pass our horizontal or weft thread. We can pass it all the way along. And then once this is put in the front, is, let's say, pulled, it creates another kind of opening that's called the counter shed. And then we can make our thread pass all the way back, secure it, and then cross it again and carry on. And with this operation and with our 2 rows, we can obtain our simplest fabric weave, which is tabby, where our warp threads are, let's say, binary or regularly alternated with the weft thread. If we add more, and that's the importance of composite tools, that they are fluid. So if we add rows of thread, we can obviously, we always must add also for each row a bar or a heddle. We can create more combination, so more pattern in our textiles, the more we add. But in this case, it is interesting to know that if already some sort of division and cognitive process was going on there just to set up the loom, if we add our rows, something more complex happens there, because something very close to what we call nowadays coding, because we will have to follow some patterns, some of which will be beneficial and produce an harmonious outcome. Some other ones, a much earlier one, which for us is maybe incorrect, but it's not. It's just, something less harmonious. So to remember this combination, again, is something that reveals a lot about the ancient thinking process and the problem that they had to deal, even cognitively, let's say. But what can we do if we only have this in the archaeological record? Well, luckily, we have one of the best components of our composite tool to reveal a little bit what was going on there. Because the loom weights have this function that may be considered neglectable or extremely steady, but they influence a lot of what goes on, especially like here from the start. If we have a loom weight, as for a spindles, I would take all measurement possible, but I would need 2 in particular that they have some sort of influence of the final product. And this is all based on experimental archaeology, but very rigorously proven, let's say. So imagine that, we have to imagine though, when we have a single loom weight, that our set will be composed of identical loom weights. This is an ideal scenario. This is what we find in iconography. If we think of Greek vessels depicting a loom, they always have all the same loom weights at the bottom. Because this is the best scenario to control the tension of the threads. Well, if we have these and we know the weight of a loom weight, and we hypothesize rowing tensions, if we divide the tension by the weight, the mass of the tool, we will find the number of threads that can be attached at each loom weight. Now, experimentally, they have found that if these threads are too little or too many, the loom can be ineffective or even not work at all. So there are some ideal numbers to be attached to a single loom weight to be functional. And then, because loom weights work, let's say, in 2 rows, if we multiply this number of objects that we obtain per 2 loom weights, and if we divide the number we obtain by the thickness of the weight, then we can obtain the number of threads that we will have in our final outcome in a tapping weave. This is all made in this case for obviously the basic outcome. And this is very important for us because it allows us to see if in our context, for example, we have different type of loom weights, if they were used or more suitable for certain for producing certain type of fabrics, less dense, or in case of working better with some kind of type of tension, also if they were more inclined to be used with thick or thinner thread. And so if we have some variability in our production or not. With loom weights and spindles, though, we always have to think that this is our, let's say, only approach in a way that we are archaeologists and we need to be scientists, and we have these evidence here only. Unfortunately, we don't have more. But I acknowledge, as many of my colleagues always do, that the human component can play a role here. And that obviously this is an abstract reconstruction, and when the humans are there, they can find solution to obviously extend this range of possibilities even more and to adjust a bit better and produce maybe stuff that we don't see. This slide is only to expand a little bit more in the material culture of weaving, where we are lucky enough for some period to have more evidence. We have this very nice plate illustrating how spools were used in a work-weighted loom. I would pay a bit of attention to this part here, this band, because we'll be back to talk about textile bands in a few seconds. But also, for example, other implements that are rare in the archaeological record, but again, they bear traces of being used against fibers, and that they were probably used for inserting thread or beating thread while weaving. They are extremely useful. I had a chance of experimenting with the work-weighted loom, and even if you can use your fingers, your nails to push the weft up, for example, I personally found having a bitter much easier. So yes, finally something that I can say for now for certainty. If we have a loom weight in our archaeological record, yes, we have the work-weighted loom. Again, as I said, many outcomes that we can obtain by using this tool, but at least this can be connected to a simple tool. But is it true if we have loom weights, that's the main kind of loom we have in our scenario, in our contexts? Or is the situation more complicated? Answer is always yes. I got to learn here some of the main looms that we have in the Mediterranean. The main variant of a big loom is the ground loom, especially used in Egypt. And again, by wandering around in Cyprus, I came across this very interesting horizontal ground loom for mat weaving. And I was wondering whether, like, maybe for a different kind of interwoven, let's say, material, textile-like, but not quite like mat weaving, they were using completely different setting, or if that, in modern times, obviously, or if that reflects maybe like some sort of ancestry And there were this kind of looms even in the past in using Cyprus for more artifacts to weave even textiles, but then it just got, let's say, fossilized for one single use. We will never know, but it's always interesting to observe and find something to think of the past in a more complex way, rather than just relying on archaeology. And in the Aegean, they have recently, relatively recently, put out this idea that I found very interesting, which is mainly based on trying to connect the iconography to the making. And I observed that a lot of garments have textile bands, especially bands with patterns, which can be done with the work with the loom, obviously, but it's much easier and in a way more comfortable to make with other devices like tablets or the rigid handles, which also allow to be creative and make more patterns, let's say. But obviously they don't allow to have wide textiles. The maximum width that you have is the width of the handle. And I started thinking of our own iconographic record. And I found that obviously in each period we have some depictions of band textiles. And even we have in that plate that I showed before, a band in the making. So taking advantage of a dwarf-weighted loom already set for something to weave an independent band. Not attached to the loom weight as we have seen, so with another kind of strategy of weaving implement probably. Once again, I cannot prove just from the iconography that any of those implements were used, because the work-weighted looms or other looms are also suitable to make these bands. But when they are like isolated, for example, in that case, I wouldn't set up a work-weighted loom, a big loom to weave just a little band. So once again, we have hints that something more could have been there, but not quite sure, obviously, on what. And again, to carry on with the question, do we have more beyond these? And this is, for example, another photo that a bit attached to. It's very famous. It's been circulated to many media. And portrays the perfect picture that a textile archaeology want to imagine. But beyond this, which is there, obviously, there is also that. Other implements, other figures weaving, unexpectedly, perhaps. So variability and something that we always have to keep in mind in textiles and other, obviously, productions. And here it's just to briefly tell you how I approach what textile archaeologists in general approach remains of textiles. We have a strict protocol to follow. We normally go with our portable microscope, so we can obtain measurements of the threads or having an idea of the thread count per centimeter, square centimeters, and obviously a better view. And we try to record as many of the characteristics of both the thread and the weave that we can see, obviously. This doesn't allow us to see the fibers. For that, we need a bit more powerful means. We need to sample them and send them to scanning electron microscope. And in that case, the definition is so precise and that is at a fiber level. We can see the fiber, and again, if it's possible, to identify it. Now, when I put together my presentation, I told that, yes, maybe you should be in my shoes and start and deal with what I normally deal, so the textile tools. But obviously, like the contexts, okay, the places where our textile tools were retrieved are not a secondary piece of information. They are very important. Now, I wanted just to show you in particular in detail what's the technology and how we deal with our analysis of single artifacts. But these slides, it's always remember that this information must be there, special analysis must be there, and it's important. And we can also use it to challenge what we have seen in terms of technology or function. One thing that I wanted to obviously note, and maybe again, this can be a matter of discussion, even if because our activities will take place here and not outside, is that textile tools are mostly portable. They can be dismantled and reassembled, like even big looms, and move from a space to space, and exactly dismantled to make some space, especially in houses. Or like spindles, they are very, very much portable. You can spin everywhere. You can even spin while you are walking around. Okay. And this is very important to notice because it complicates a little bit, obviously, our picture, because fine spots of textile tools may not even as informative as that of other tools, like a big worm, for example, that stays there. But they allow us anyway to think and to grab some more information. What I personally would like to tell today and discourage to do is to be very, let's say, not to use quantities in a super strict way. What do I mean? Is that sometimes archaeologists, when they look at context, they only count spindles and count hands. So if I have 3 spindles in one household and just one in another one, in good contexts, obviously in the houses that have 3 spindles, I have the potential to have more thread produced. But if these quantities are have a little gap, let's say, and it's not hundreds more or thousands more, I don't think this is a good indicator to suggest specialization or to suggest that something more was going on there, because as archaeologists, we are always to think that of what we don't see. And in this case, especially with spinning, but also with weaving, we never see the time. We never see how much time consuming it is, this activity, but also we never consider it as an activity, for example, that can be stopped and resumed at any time. So there is no reason to think that these two, for example, but saying, I mean, this is just an example, obviously, that if we have 3 or 1, these were used at the same time with the same amount of hours daily, so that we can tell for certainty that one production is 3 times larger than the other. We don't know how the different spinners manage their time, if they have other activities, for example. And especially, we don't know if they belong to bigger families with bigger needs, for example. So I would really recommend to be always very, very careful with just counting or just projecting what we see in the archaeology in terms of number. It's obviously more things to consider. And because we are talking of contexts, I would grab the opportunity to talk of the last textile activity that I've been able to see through archaeology in my studies, which is textile dyeing. And why, in this case, contexts are fundamental? In this case, they are fundamental because there is nothing in textile dyeing, no tools or implements, that they are so specific to that activity that if we find them, we can certainly say, well, that's some textile dye was going on there, not like the spindles or the loom weights. If you remember yesterday, we had a big pot and a wooden ladle to make halloumi. That, it reminded me of a perfect setting for dyeing, for example, because to dye we need to boil water and to have a natural, in this case, dye, which is a coloring substance that is soluble in water and can be boiled. And we need to put our fibers or fabric in our pot. and make it boil. Sometimes we add a mordant, which is a fixative of the dye into the fiber. And that's all we need. And it can be conducted in small quantity, in a small pot, or in bigger quantity. So if we have association in our record, as we have in certain sites, of, let's say, evidence for boiling, structure for boiling, fireplaces, cooking pots, and structure that they allow liquid processing, even rinsing and washing, or have availability of water, like Middle Bronze Age Arini, or in this workshop that is in the temple area at Kition. One of the hypotheses that we can suggest is that these could have been used for textile dyeing. But obviously, this will remain indirect evidence. And again, other activities could have taken advantage of this setting. But yes, this is what normally we have as an ideal setting for textile dyeing. And yes, we have on Cyprus even direct evidence, which is normally like dye stains or on pots or on the ground next to this lovely basin, Ara Sultan Tekke. And that's absolutely secure direct evidence. But this is very rare. So I think we are here, like textile archaeologists here are always like finding themselves into two sides when it's about textile dyeing. Some of us only consider like direct evidence, real proof of dyeing. And they would dismiss what I told you about Erimi and Kition before, even as a working hypothesis. Some other ones, though, would accept what I told about Erimi and Kition, because we know that this is an extremely elusive kind of activity. In my opinion, it's always worth to considering it if there is enough evidence, like at Erimi and Kition. And not direct evidence anyway, even if we cannot prove it, obviously, with direct evidence. Why? Because wandering around once again, I came across many times this very interesting vessel, that long one in the picture, which is called pitarin. And pitarin it's used in traditional textile activities here in Cyprus to dye trousers. And I noticed that most of the times there is no stains, and nothing you can see, because all the dyes that they were used in traditional Cyprus are actually vegetable dyes, so they really don't leave stains behind. It would be interesting, obviously, to do residue analysis and see if there is residues we cannot see. But again, even in something that is we know, and it is a knowledge that is specialized for textile dyeing, in this case, there may be no traces at all. So I think it's always worth having textile dyes as an hypothesis in our picture. Another thing that I will throw there, just in case we come across it in the discussion, is that textile archaeologists have always linked natural dyes to wool, saying that wool is much faster, easier material to dye compared to flax, and lasts longer. So every time that there is a dye setting, we think that wool was involved. But is this true? How we talked to practitioners, how we experimented? Very little yet. So this is a thing that can be challenged, I think. Well, now I'm finally finished with the presentation, and I hope that now these objects that they are sometimes a bit neglected and left there in museums, like maybe in a corner or in a shelf, and we are attracted to obviously other stuff. Maybe now they can tell you more every time you go to a museum of themselves, and you remember of them. But now, yes, we look forward to move to archaeology, from archaeology to practice. But before doing it, let me thank you very much for listening to this. I hope it wasn't too boring. And let me also remind you that this is part of a bigger project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. It's called Textile Landscape of Cyprus, where I'll be investigating the resources and the relationship between textile production and the landscape in which that was happening in the past, from the Bronze Age into the Hellenistic and Roman period. So thank you very much.
Julia, I think it's been a very nice couple of days, I would say, and I really hope that we continue these discussions between archaeologists and designers. Generally, I find that when you mix two disciplines together, you really get very interesting results and very nice conversations. So the questions that I heard yesterday, sort of more towards Alejandro's work and about clay and pottery, they were quite new and fresh, and I would say that in keeping up a conversation like this between scientists and archaeologists and designers, I think we can only benefit from it. So I'm hoping that this will be the first of many sessions like this. So what I would like to do today, I'm going to skip my introduction part. Thankfully, I like that. But what I thought I would do today, I will give you a very, very short presentation of how I view textile design, a very, very different sort of approach towards my practice. And so I wanted to connect really how archaeology and textile design share some methodologies, perhaps. So in a very simple and a very sort of straightforward way, I found some things that we have in common that perhaps there are common language and common methodologies. So I'll sort of talk you through that, and then everything will be a much more hands-on session. So a short introduction, and then feel free to ask me any questions. And then there's a table at the back with lots of samples and different sort of artifacts that I will talk about. There's the loom that we will have a look, and then there's two pieces in front of me here that are sort of much more representative of my work. So as I said, I wanted to sort of lay down a very sort of a shared ground that I found that we have as both practitioners between Julia and myself, or other archaeologists and sort of textile designers. I really think that we share these similar methodologies. So in weaving, at the very early stages of the project, what we usually do is we really narrow the search. We focus closely onto the detail. It's all about the detail. We rely, first of all, on patience, on in-depth observation of whatever it is that we will design, whether it's surface, pattern making, or a textile that is going to end up being for a sort of object use. And we also find ourselves having a lot of repetitive actions. This is something that I'm sure archaeologists will probably be familiar with. So we work quite slowly, and in many cases we document quite carefully to be able to trace our steps and know where we are at every stage of making. And we find ourselves returning again and again and again to the same surface. And in many ways we do that because we need to decode it. And the way that I see it sometimes is that we often find ourselves again thinking inside the box. We work in this sort of very structured and very sort of methodological sort of way. We operate a lot within constraints, rules, limitations, and on many occasions with material limits. So we are quite limited in our practice. But I find that the limits that we have and all these rules and systems that exist within our practice, it's exactly where our creativity emerges. That's where magic can happen. So we sort of uncover the different possibilities of our practice by embracing these limitations and not finding them sort of constraining. And a very clear example of this, it's a shared logic that we have between archaeologists and weavers, and it's this concept of gridding. And I'm sure that you're all familiar with it. So in archaeology, I don't even want to explain it because the majorities are not there archaeologists. So what we do as archaeologists, so you divide the landscape, don't you? You have everything in measured squares, and to be able to, again, to trace your steps, to know exactly where everything was documented, to have a system and a way to analyze the data, right? And exactly the same way textile design operates in an identical way. So gridding marks the surface of the weave, whether it is in a repeat or as an entire textile, was what we see is here. And it's basically locating the design, the pattern, and mapping out the structure. That's exactly what we do again. In practice, what we do, I think, first of all, it's strikingly similar. The outcomes are entirely different, of course, but I think the mindset is very shared. So it is analytical, it is very structured, and it is very repetitive. So again, why is this something that is interesting? I think, again, that's where creativity again happens. So we observe that sometimes creativity perhaps can be perceived as some sort of expression without limits, let yourself free, be a bit more loose. I mean, as a teacher, I remember saying this to my students, get a larger piece of paper, try something different. But when you teach weaving and when you work with design that there's so many restrictions, you have to think slightly different. So again, it is discovery and exploration within a specific framework. And within this context, I find that because weaving has a lot of tools, tool making and material testing and all this skill development that is required to be able to operate such a small machine, but actually quite complex. And again, it's another way of demonstrating that we have creative thought. And again, modern times demonstrate the same. Perhaps in antiquities, you have the same. Creative thought was evident just by using a specific type of tool, such as the vertical loom or this type of loom again. So experimentation and failure, they're all practices that definitely generate knowledge and demonstrate problem solving again and again, basically. So I find that weaving embodies a perfect balance of this. So we have rules within design, the storytelling with mathematics, and there's aesthetics and functions. All of these coexist with weaving. And I feel that that's sort of the beauty of it. Now, sort of moving, I think Julia touched upon a bit this, moving towards the sort of modern sort of look of how weaving operates at the moment. At its core, weaving is binary. It is 1 and 0, over and under, black and white, 0 and 1. It is a very simple logic, but we have very complex structures that can emerge through it. A small example is this one here. So very, very shortly, I wanted to introduce how we ended up here in this binary language here we have. So before this type of notation existed, fabric itself acted as memory. So what we had was memorized, and it was passed down from generation to generation. Every single pattern was not notated, but it was memorized, and it was embedded within the fabric. Why is that interesting? It's because designing and weaving were one entire thing. They were not separated at any way. And the amazing thing is that we still have communities around the world that work in the same way. And perhaps sometimes we work in the same way, although we use notation. Just very briefly, around the 17th century in mainland Europe, we have the first sort of traces of notation. They looked a bit more like musical scores. They were again systems. They were schematic sort of layouts. There were symbols. They didn't look like that, but they had traces of sort of this binary system starting to appear. And later on, we have this. We have the point draft. Point paper or graph paper, as they call it sometimes. And basically, it is every square represents one thread, or sometimes we call it pixels. So it depends on how you're working and what sort of complex design you want to have. But the interesting thing about this is that this is exactly well designed. It's separated from weaving. So we can now design entirely without the loom being prepared. We can have the whole structure laid out in black and white squares. We know exactly how the textile it's a bit of a stretch. We never know exactly how the textile will be, no matter how much we plan. And even in industry, there's always the element of surprise. And this is why weaving is exciting. My personal opinion. But yeah, this is the separation of the two. And this definitely marks a very, very interesting sort of moment in time for me. Again, very briefly, of course, I think you probably know that this binary sort of structure of weaving really led to punch card systems. Punch card systems led to the jacquard loom. This is a completely different and huge subject that we're not going to go into at all. But basically, this was the first direct machine readable instruction that inspired first computers, basically. And I will leave this huge subject there. There's a post there for anyone who wants to sort of do further research on this. So the idea is that before all of this happened, before notation was still around, we have creative knowledge embedded within the fabric. So designs, colors, symbols, and meaning is transmitted through practice, memory, and repetition. So the creative act is embodied within the making. This is where I think is quite important. So at every stage, even in hand-woven textiles and industrially woven textiles, what is important is the human presence, I think. And every textile, I think, carries parts of us in it. There's decision making at every stage. Our fingerprints are there with every fabric, and even in industrial textiles, I find. So I think weaving, perhaps sometimes like archaeology, it really depends on the relationship, and this is what it is. It's between the different environments that we work with, the different systems that we operate, and between the people and the material. So it's sort of this interplay between all of us together. So the last section that I wanted to sort of say is why does this matter? So why highlight the creativity between these two practices? So I find that in archaeology, archaeology is a social science, isn't it? And woven textiles is a design discipline, but it's very much often sort of described as much more technical, more analytical as a discipline. But I feel that it's a very creative subject. And it requires interpretation and reconstruction, imagination, but there's always a focus on material. And in textiles, no matter what sort of objects that we have in front of us, we have to remember that we have coded surfaces, and they carry memory and labor and mathematics, culture and identity. And the beautiful thing is that when you do have, unfortunately in Cyprus, we don't have that as a practice anymore. But in other communities where you have the textile practice alive, so you still have hand spinning and you still have hand weaving and you still have traditional patterns that are carried from memory, from a very young age, then you can really see how identity is embedded in textile and then how storytelling is embedded in textile. That's sometimes lost through time. And when you have, traditional textiles that continue on, but without the meaning, without the storytelling, that's perhaps sometimes when they lose a bit their soul and they become objects instead of artifacts. So there's just some thought there for what we have in front of us sometimes for traditional textiles. And sort of to conclude, what I thought we sort of mentioned is that for me, that everything, the whole discipline, this idea of how material practices happened through the textile and this intersect that exists of the two disciplines, I find that at the center of the whole thing, it is us. It is a very human practice. So, and we can't separate it. We can't have, having it as a technical sort of discipline, perhaps. It is a practice that requires human interaction, and it is something that we have to recognize that practice that connects past and present, expression, there's an analysis, but there's always imagination there. I think this is something that it would be very nice to be sort of continued on and viewed in that way. So what I thought I would share with you is going back to the codes and going back to perhaps more sort of technical way of weaving, but I wanted to invite you to do a small exercise with me. This is more the hands-on part of what we're going to do. As we only have one loom, probably going to run out of time for everyone to sort of try out this loom. I will pass some graph paper, and I would invite you to code with me and come and design some patterns with me and sort of move away from the beauty and the aesthetics and try to find some sort of meaning or some sort of language that you can add into these black and white squares, your own personal meaning, whatever that is. That could be a number, that could be a language, that could be a memory, that whatever that is, and try and see if you could design something like that yourself, and we could try and weave it if you're brave enough to try it. So this is something that we're going to do. Just to mention a few things about the loom. This is a loom. This is a design that we did together in the studio. It is a loom made here in Cyprus. It has a very long journey. This loom started in England in collaboration with a loom company that I used to work with. They used to be called Harris Looms. They unfortunately are no longer in business. After 18 years, they've disappeared from the market. But the design is there, and we kept working and sort of perfecting it. The little thing that it has is that it folds, basically. It's a loom that allows for the work to be perfectly intact, the textile to be perfectly intact, but the whole mechanism folds and it becomes a flat back object. And the idea was that I wanted to introduce something like that to be able to safeguard weaving within the educational system and to have the ability to have looms in schools, in universities, mainly for universities. This tool is mainly for universities, and have the luxury to still have workshop spaces. I was based in the UK for many years, and workshop spaces were reduced. They're still being reduced. I don't know at what size now. So this was a real need to sort of have a tool that preserves textiles, allows us to explore as many techniques as possible, but actually it limits space. This is usually the problem with textile design. It takes too much space. So that's the result of it. It's still not perfect and it's still a work in progress. I'm hoping at some point I'm going to say it is not no more a work in progress and it's stopped, but it perfectly fits the purpose and it operates really nicely. And I invite you to come and touch it and play with it. Nothing breaks. There's no way that you can damage it. It's been well tested with from children to adults as well. So yeah, I really invite you to sort of come and have a look at it. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to pass through this. So this is the graph paper that we talked about. And I will leave this up because this sort of gives you some inspiration of what patterns look like. The one on the left is plain weave, is what Julia mentioned quite a lot. It's the basic fundamental pattern, which is basically one up, one down. And then it goes on from there. And it's endless. There's a couple of books there on the table that you can see the amount of weaving patterns that exist. And it also depends on how complex your loom is. So I will pass them through and you can pass them behind you. And I'll give some to as well.
To replicate or to reproduce, and it's just to challenge its change.
She presented
That doesn't matter.
exact of the code of your presentation. I was wondering what say, and I will start.
What it's looking at? Can you tell me what it's looking at?
It's a real magic.
And that's sort of synchronized. So if it's there,
Ahora sería azul.
Next, while you're
stuck.
I'm going to be while you're doing some patterns, I'm going to just talk a tiny bit about the loom, so you understand a tiny bit how you would notate and what does that mean for the loom, right? We have here patterns, the black and white patterns. That's exactly what you will be notating. Try to keep your designs. You have one word that says shafts underneath, and the other one that says ticks, right? So shafts are these. These are these metal bars that go up and down, and they basically control a small group of threads. When one is lifted, there's a group of threads that are lifted, and it creates a gap in between, and that's where we will pass the thread. So the number of shafts that we have, it's an indicator of how complex our pattern is. So at our studio, we have 4 shaft looms for students and for something, but I work on a 24 shaft loom. So, and there's 4, 8, 16, 24, 32 shaft looms. So bigger patterns, much more difficult sort of structures, more complex textiles. That's the idea. When you have a black square on your paper, that means one of these will be up. So if you write number 1 up, this is up. Number 1, 2, 3, 4. If you write a combination of different ones, so for example, if you've got black and white square, like the first pattern, the plain weave. So we've got number 1, black, number 2, white, number 3, black, number 4, white. That means number 1 will be up, and then number 2 will be up. Number 3 and 4, which is on this side, they remain down. That's the gap that's created, and that's where we're weaving. In practice, it's easier to understand it if you actually weave with it. But that's why, because of the number, we have to write first and then try and weave. So another combination, for example, what we have in the screen there, I've got number 1 and 2, it's black, so that means it's up. And number 3 and 4 is down. So it will be number 1 again, and number 2, number 3 and 4 is down. So that will give me the second box here, which is called a basket weave. I'm sure that you've heard this word before, a basket. So all of these different combinations will give you a different pattern, a very different look. The table on the left, we've got a long strip of fabric, a white fabric, with the different patterns attached to it. You will see how a different pattern looks like, so the texture that it produces. By changing 1 or 2 variations in the pattern, the textile just looks entirely different. And it feels very different as well. It's not just the pattern, it's also the texture that's produced. So I invite you to try out different combinations. And if whoever feels sort of brave, we can weave. I've got some bobbins here. So these are the bobbins. So this is how you would have one bobbin, and this is where you would weave. So I can demonstrate. I will try and weave the wrong way around so you can actually get to see it. So usually you stand at the front and you see your textile. But just for demonstration sort of purpose, I will just try and do it at the front. So that's the yarn pass through. This is the basket weave. Remember the second box I said. I will drop it down from here. Then I will come and use these, the reed is called, metal structure here, to push the thread back into its place. And that's where the textile starts to be created. I already have woven something here. I've got a plain weave and a twill. And just for reference, a twill is a structure that we're all very familiar with. Anyone who's wearing jeans at the moment has a twill pattern on them. So twill is what jeans are made from, all types of jeans. There's basically a diagonal line. It is the one here. It is the second box down there. That's a twill. Diagonal line that goes all across the textile is one of the most common patterns that you can find in the industry. So yeah, you continue on. No, so you lift, you pass the thread through, use the beater to feed it down, and then you move on. And again, and again, and again. This is the repetitive action that I talked about before. It is very repetitive, but it has a very sort of meditative feel to it. Not for everyone, not everyone has the patience to do it, but I feel that everyone always finds something interesting, either the mathematics behind the pattern they're weaving, the material that you can weave with, the pattern that you can create, or even the final product that you have. On this occasion, I'm weaving with a cotton yarn that is naturally dyed. You can weave with absolutely anything. It could be metal, it could be wood, it could be different structures, anything that you can imagine, especially on a handloom, not in an industrial. This is the beauty of hand weaving. You have the ability to sort of have the shed open, which is this gap that is created, and pass whatever you want through the gap. Something like that. For sharp loom, they've calculated the different pattern combinations that you can have. And if I'm not mistaken, it's between, I think, it's about 25,000 different combinations just on a 4-shaft loom. So it's endless, the pattern making that you can have. And that also varies on the way that you thread the loom. So the loom is threaded in a specific way. You change that, everything changes again. So those 25,000 combinations that I talked about suddenly multiply even more. So when someone tells me, oh, it's just a 4-shaft loom, it doesn't do much, it does a lot. It can do a lot. And if you keep pushing the limits, it does even more and more. And you have a bigger loom. So these textiles were produced on a 24-shaft loom. And the big difference is that the scale of the pattern. So here you can see a pattern that emerges that's blown up. It's bigger. This is actually plain weave. It's all plain weave. The first weave, the most basic weave, but it's just a different threading, and it produces a very different type of pattern. So this is one of the techniques that I love. And if I sort of end up working only with this technique and sort of trying different variations of it, I will probably not even find the sort of end to these different combinations. So it just shows you even a simple technique, but one change, it can produce endless amount of patterns. So yeah, feel free to pick them up and touch them as well. This is a woolen fabric and that's a cotton fabric. So is there anyone brave enough to have a go? Very intimidating up here. Okay, draw. Yeah. Do your design then. Yeah.
This is, I'm right.
Yeah.
Running
Sure.
If I speak to the
I'd like to introduce flowers. We have probably a snake. Because I was going to do it. I thought it was like so.
That's good.
No, I didn't just do what you're reading.
Last
So you had to like color in all 3 seconds. At least we got some, but they have.
That's a very different kind of technique. What they do is that instead of using the making,
It's like
that
one
one
looks like moving.
yeah,
And if you lift that, so basically what you have is like your design
So
the other way around. So
what
like
what
the
they do their own something. It's all
fabric
like
emerges, it's like woven
onto
down.
the weave.
So this is
Also
going to
in
be
future
yeah.
That's all.
It's like I don't know.
You have this sort of embroidery technique embedded onto the weave.
Because that's all I've done is the mini notes, I've done with pictures. So I've never done anything. I've never tried to design.
That's more important.
That's interesting. Okay, so we're doing that. Why is this like?
It's more space. No, that's just more space, just a confusion. This is just basically more different spaces to understand that the pattern occupies the whole area. And if it is squeezed into different areas where you have a repeat, or if it's elongated like that, again, different variations when we talk about.
If you've only got 4 thingies, does it?
Yes, but you could go all the way up.
Okay, so we should have done the 4 things.
Exactly, that's the idea. So the 4 shafts are the ones, that's your limit. However, if you do split it, people design some sort of bigger designs.
Yeah.
What we'll do, we'll use the first one, and then we'll move on to it. 6, 7, 8.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
we have 2 versions of working with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. On this table here, or whoever wants to stand up, we have to do it. Yes. There's some textiles that they're hand woven, they're all hand woven. We have very different combinations here. We've got silks and wools and cottons and some sort of synthetics as well. We have this idea of weaving something inside the textile, so you actually have a 3-dimensional shape that appears. We have the textile that has weight inside, so it has fluidity to it. These are just tiny samples that were either developed in bigger designs or were just sort of marking the design, just like that. These are the 2 samples, the only samples that I have of silkwood. It's not really in production anymore. But this is how silkwood used to feel. It has its own beauty. These are all the different natural dyes that I use. They are from different materials from Cyprus. There's one that I love. There's 2 actually that I actually love. This is from the hibiscus tree. This is the color that it produces. it is a really amazing dye that transforms with oxygen. So in the dye vat, the yarn looks quite different. But the more exposed to oxygen it is, when you remove it from the water, it really transforms. And it transforms it, it ends up looking like this color. Yeah, flower, just the flower, yeah. Now and throughout the summer as well. So it's the beginning of the season. And there's another one that I want to highlight, which I use a lot of, and it's a technique that uses ceramics, uses the mud. So what I use Alejandro's leftovers for what it is when he basically processes the clay, and we use it to dye. This is cotton yarn, and there's so much iron oxide inside the clay that I use it to stain the textiles. We tested it to see sort of the resistance of it, and we have to say it really does stain nice. So also with textiles that you don't want to stain. So, but this is the result of a very, very short time within the dye vat, within the clay. This is the color that you get. So the longer you leave it in, the richer the color would be. And of course, there's so much more to experiment with other different types of clay. We've done some on fabrics with a much more lighter color, but the most successful one has been also on this classic ceramic. Yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering, what do you use as a mordant, if any?
Protein. Usually I coat everything with some sort of protein, like soya, milk. There's alum as well. If anyone is familiar with natural dyes, alum is something that exists. But I found that it's much easier to source something that's local and I don't have to ship alum from abroad, which is just coating things with soy and the protein. What you need with natural fibers like this is to allow to help them absorb the dye and also to keep the dye, because that's the difficult thing. Dye fades, and it will fade eventually, not in white, but it will change color. So you need protein to sort of keep the color stable. There's some textiles here that we sort of exposed the textile in sunlight, and you could see how they change. How they change color through time. There it is. You see two different colors that appear. That's the original one, and that's the one that was exposed in the sun. So when we say that the color fades, that doesn't mean it becomes white. It just changes. All colors fade, even industrial textiles. You know, when you have a black t-shirt and you buy it's black, it's never the same black as when it was originally bought. It changes. Same with natural dyes. So you have this fading, and I call it transforming. It's not fading, it transforms, and it will keep transforming again and again and again. You rarely will have a natural dye that will become white, because it's staying in the textile. It's there. It's permanently sort of changed it. So it's just another color. These are a mixture of different flowers, so like marigolds, I've got walnuts. We've got madder, which is local to Cyprus. It's the root, a very distinct root that we use it for Easter egg, same material. But we have one specific one that we grew with Alejandro. It was a sunflower. It's called Hobby Black. It produces really huge sunflower heads, and the seeds produce this amazing deep color. And you see that this is silk, this is linen, and this is cotton. You see the difference of how different fibers absorb the different color. So the more fibers you have, the more variation in color you will have. And it depends on the look that you're going for. You will choose silk, absorbs really nicely. But it's silk. So you have the limitations of the luxury product. So, but it absorbs very beautifully. Linen always has this texture, and cotton is much more muted, much more pastel color. And this is on fabric. When you use it on hand-woven fabric, then it's a different story as well, because the fibers are not blended in the same way, so they would basically create this effect that's called heat cut, which is almost like resist dyeing. Some areas are dyed nicely, some areas are not. So another technique is dyeing. But what I do when I use it for hand weaving, I dye the yarn. So I dye the yarn and then I'll use it for So yeah, please feel free to have a look. There's some tools here. This is the one that we use to sort of measure the centimeters, how many yards we have per centimeter for woven and weft. These are the shuttles that we use, and these are the small collection of black and white patterns. You can see of how they look and how we design. So this is one of the classic books of weaving. It's falling apart, as you can see, but it still does the job. But yeah, this is how woven patterns look like. Finally, before I leave you tonight, this is our small experiment with. This is the thing I wanted to show you with Alejandro. So we've been trying to use the clay to sort of design replicas of loom weights. So we sort of selected shapes, tried to, as accurately as possible, find the correct weight. But of course, these are not fired. So when they are fired, the weight will transform. So we'll see the variation that we're trying. And the idea is that we'll put them into use. So we'll see how they actually interact with the different yarns that we have. Of course, these will not be used on that loom. We need a vertical loom to actually use them. But yeah, they will hopefully become part of the practice. We also use weights in this type of weaving for the beam at the back. See, if you stand up, there's a beam at the back. At the back, there's about 3 meters worth of yarn that's wrapped around. That's the thing that gives the tension. So loom weights replaced that. So that replaced loom weights. The beam and the wrapping around the yarn replaced loom weights. We still use weight at the back when we want to add yarns. And we want to have extra warps, as we say. So to add a different color or to add something to complicate textiles even more, we still use weights that are hanging at the bottom. So we'll see how we will try and use. So yeah, feel free to touch them. They're not fired, so they're a bit more fragile. But yeah, they're here, and I'm curious to hear what everyone has to say about them. But yeah, I will leave you to sort of stand up and have a look, and hopefully someone will weave. A brave person will weave.
Yeah,
there we go. It's not one. Something